Welcome to the Workplace Podcast. We've got an incredible guest today, and I'm really excited for the insights and ideas they'll be sharing. There are so many practical learnings from the conversation that will make a difference to you, your team, or organization. If your organization is interested in a workshop on this topic of the podcast, feel free to get in touch via our website, yellowwood.ie. If you want to support our podcast, and you'll find a link to our Patreon in the podcast description. Thanks in advance for listening and your support. Now, let's take a different path to success. Welcome to the Workplace Podcast. Joining me today is Alison Taylor to discuss her book, Higher Ground: How Business Can Do the Right Thing in a Turbulent World. Alison is a clinical associate professor at NYU Stern School of Business and a former executive director of Ethical Systems. She has spent the past 2 decades consulting with multinational companies on risk, anti-corruption, sustainability, human rights, culture and behaviour, stakeholder engagement, ESG, and ethics and compliance. Her first book, Higher Ground, has been featured on the Financial Times Best Summer Reading List of 2024. Alison, welcome to the Workplace Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Alison, this book has received such high praise. If you go to your website, you'll see it all. But I'm just going to take out one quote from Adam Grant, what a lot of our listeners will know. A practical guide to holding on to your values in a polarized world of work. Alison Taylor has extensive experience working with leaders on responsibility and ethics, and her recommendations are principled and pragmatic. How cool is that?
It's good. Yeah, I was very grateful to get him to be able to get him to read it.
Yeah, so I found this book very timely, if I'm honest, Alison, with all that's going on. So we'll talk about this later on. And it's really hard for leaders to do the right thing. So it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. And I think this book really helps you as leaders navigate through all the increasing amount of challenges, both internally and externally, that the organization is faced with. You introduce new terms, you provide case studies, the different challenges when it comes to ESG, for example, but it's underpinned by human rights. No, I love that aspect to this. So we'll get all to that later on. One of the first things you start talking about in the book, because you talk about stakeholder capitalism, you talk about the triple bottom line, like people, profit and planet. It's very confusing for people, isn't it?
I think that's the right place to start any conversation about this topic. I don't know about you. Well, you probably don't have these conversations, but when I'm talking to people, ordinary people, cab drivers, and they say, what do you do? And I say, I work on like business ethics and responsibility. Pretty much 100% of people either say, isn't that an oxymoron? Or they go, oh, they need that, all the help they can get with that. I think there's a kind of collective eye roll when the topic comes up. And then I think another big problem we need to kind of get on the table right up front is that weird jargon is a feature, not a bug of this landscape. I mean, let's take the word ethics. I thought it was really fascinating when I was interviewing people for the book. They'd be like, oh, I try not to use that word. People expect you to start singing hymns and kind of lecturing them and coming up with rules. So we seem to have a problem with the word ethics. We all know that the term ESG has become completely controversial. I'm not sure that we even need more weird three-letter acronyms in our lives. And so we've got this situation where I think the public is frustrated. We don't trust business. We feel they should be doing a better job. But when we start to try and talk about what that looks like, it gets really, really confusing to the degree we don't even have the shared words or a shared language to talk about the problem that we're actually trying to solve. So one of the reasons I wrote the book is to try and kind of clear up some of that jargon and get to the point and explain why this topic's got so controversial.
And that's what's so good is each chapter, then you have a summary at the end, and you go through and you explain all of those terms, and then you give us examples of all of those and where it happens in the business case studies there. It's fascinating there. So even as we record this, we're in very complicated times, so much certainty. So And then at the end of your book, when you're doing the summary, and that's another really good thing about the book is you've read so much, then you do a brilliant summary at the end. You say it's confusing and contradictory. So I'm going to start with this because of where we are at the moment, and this is at the start of the book as well. Is it the government's role or a business role when it comes to societal issues? Because there's a lot going on when it talks about AI and, social media and tech and all this. Like, has your thoughts changed since writing the book, or where are you at now? What's the role of business? Because it's changing, isn't it? And it has changed.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the first thing to say is that the role of business in society, the responsibilities of business, that's a perennial topic of debate. You can read Cicero on this topic. You can, we've been debating this for thousands of years, and I, for one, am not going to be able to kind of clear up that debate. But in the late 20th century, because of Milton Friedman, we kind of settled on this idea, right? Maximize shareholder value. The business of business is business. It is the job of the government to regulate business. It is the job of business to focus on making money. So you've got the government over here, the business over here, very sharp line between the two. I think we can see since then that a lot of things have happened that have made that vision a bit less practical. We can start even with something as simple as globalization. Saying a business should be subject to national laws gets more difficult if that business has gone abroad to Asia or Latin America or Africa, somewhere where there's lower rule of law, cheaper workers, they're looking for raw materials. So we can't just say, the government should sort it out when businesses are global and many of these problems are global. I think we've also, over the past several decades, become much more aware as a society of the negative externalities, the negative impacts of many business models. We can think about that in terms of social media. We can think about that in terms of oil and gas. We can think about this in terms of fast fashion, all sorts of kind of examples. So I think the public has become concerned about the impact of business and believes that business should be responsible for kind of cleaning up its own mess. But then you've got a question of kind of how you do that, what frameworks, what governance structures, what ideas. You've still got that question mark about what the role of regulation is, and then you've got questions about, is it now more profitable to try and address social and environmental challenges? Or is that still a drain on growth, a drain on profit? So underneath this, I think, is this really fascinating shift from, and I'm going to sound jargony, but from tangible to intangible value. So if you think about the biggest companies in the world in the 20th century, the people like GE and ExxonMobil, companies like GE and ExxonMobil, they're companies that manufacture and make things that pull physical, commodities out of the ground. These days, our biggest companies are in technology. They're creating intangible value. It's much more dependent on like intellectual property, research, data, software, network effects, and ultimately perception and trust. So one of the ways we can think about this really profound shift in how value is created is with the company Mattel. So Mattel, as we know, a company that makes plastic toys, but genuinely hard these days to say what the value of Mattel should be given the success of Barbie, which is about the kind of branding value, the success of the movie, how people feel about Mattel since Barbie came out. So I think that's a really good example of how the question of how value is created and derived has become much different and much more confusing. And this puts pressure on business leaders, I think, in entirely new ways.
So we're nearly as consumers or members of society, there's lots of different things going on, right? And it's all confusing and we're overwhelmed with all the information coming at us. And then you introduce this term, if it's okay, the Overton window. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yeah.
Yeah. So can you just explain this? Because I think this is a good example where you're educating the reader then when it comes to the Overton window. Can you explain that to us?
So the Overton window is a kind of political science term that's about the space for debate in
Yeah.
society. So there'll be a kind of, range of debate. We're very, very polarized in the US. There'll be kind of people that are pro and con. But the space of debate is kind of what's acceptable. If you go outside the Overton window, it's not that people will argue with you. They'll think you're crazy. So something that's outside the Overton window, as an example right now, would be the idea that a for-profit business should run at a loss because of the climate crisis. That's outside the Overton window. People sort of think that's insane. And so what I think has happened over the past decade is that the Overton window for the responsibilities of business has become broader and wider. We used to say, focus on shareholder value and not break the law. And the debate was about how we stop companies breaking the law. Now we've got the idea that business should take on and respond to climate change, inequality, animal rights, biodiversity and nature, should be letting me work from home if I feel like, should be responsible for my mental health and well-being. So the Overton window around the debate of the role of business in society has expanded dramatically. And a lot of major CEOs are sort of responsible for that. I don't know if people remember, but, in the last Trump presidency, there was all this protest, there was all this noise. You had this kind of rise of stakeholder capitalism. You had all these CEOs going out and promising to save the world. And so they kind of brought it on themselves. They did go out there saying, we can't rely on government anymore. Trust me. I'll solve all these problems. I'll solve climate change. I'll stay in the Paris Climate Agreement. I'll do something about these controversies. And so now we're going back and we're saying, well, now what about this? Now we'd like you to do something about Israel or abortion rights or something that maybe is a bit more controversial. And so one of the problems, I think, is that now we've got all these expectations and business leaders are really struggling to figure out how to say, I'll work on this, but not on that, or this is relevant to my business, but that's not relevant to my business.
And as I was reading the book, then this is where I had the question to myself. I was like, there's a case for educating, we'll say, stakeholder activists and business in general about, well, what is people's roles and what is achievable, what's not achievable, when it comes to being a profitable business, but also making a responsible business and those impacts that can make, isn't it? So there's something there about saying, listen, we have to have a fair conversation or a balanced conversation, isn't there?
Yeah, well, I think we do need a more balanced and realistic conversation. And I think one of the big problems right now is that a lot of companies and a lot of CEOs, kind of when the political winds were a little bit different, started treating this as marketing, started thinking that this would be great PR. We'll go out and we'll promise to tackle climate change and we'll get more loyal customers and more motivated employees and there'll be a big business case and we'll make more money. And I think since then, things of these topics and these questions have got much more polarized and much more controversial. And now CEOs, we can think about what's going on with DEI in America at the moment. Like big backlash against DEI, big crackdown from the government. Everyone's pulling back these policies. But then these companies still have workers and customers that want them to do something about DEI. So you can't kind of find this neutral middle ground because this neutral middle ground's kind of become a quicksand. And whatever you do, you'll have a group of people yelling at you and thinking you're totally unethical. So this, I think, again, speaks to where we started the conversation about how confused we've got about what it really means to be a good business and what the right thing to do actually is.
But saying that, because companies were doing what you call, we'd say, greenwashing or woke washing in the book. It's fascinating, all the terms that you use, I have to say. Especially young people. This is why I found a very interesting read, and younger employees became more personal. So it's that move from the professional identity that it has become more personal. That's fascinating, that insight. Can you tell me, our listeners, about that?
Yeah, I suppose one way to think about it is like thinking about my career, right? So I started working as a management consultant in the 90s. And I had this idea, you get a proper job, you go and buy loads of horrible clothes, you go and sit in the office, you sit at your desk, you work really long hours, you get told what to do. And eventually you get promoted and you get to tell other people what to do. Like, I thought that was like work and that was life. I didn't,
Yeah.
this idea you should bring your whole self to work and be able to express yourself and, kind of do what you like and work from wherever you want. I just wouldn't have understood that. Now,
Yeah.
I think young people have the idea, I've got to work somewhere aligned with my values. I'm going to look at what the CEO says and signals. I expect people to kind of accommodate me if I feel a little bit burnt out. I want to work from home on a Friday so I can walk my dog, and they're like, and the company needs to adapt to me. If I've got burnout or mental health problems or I need some time off, I need leaders to accommodate me and care about my well-being. And I also need my employer to stand up for my values and the things I believe in. It's almost like we've stopped thinking there's any point in voting. We've started thinking that, if I've got a problem out there with something going on in society, it's more reliable to depend on a brand or my employer to do something about that problem than to use kind of the democratic system or rely on the policy process. So I think a lot of this is about the fact that we don't trust the government or rely on the government anymore. But again, this puts a lot of pressure on companies to take on issues and to address issues that they're not necessarily designed to do. And I worry a little bit that some of these expectations, where I understand where they come from, like I think it's really positive that people want to have careers they believe in and work that they find really motivating. But I fear that in some cases, we've created expectations that aren't very realistic.
Yeah, because it seems like by taking that approach, a lot of maybe managers or leaders are listening in here kind of going, the pendulum has to swing some way back towards that sense of self-determination and agency and self-reliance, isn't it? So that's that Overton window again, isn't it? Where we need to have this debate to go, okay, we need to push back here to be realistic on these expectations.
Yeah, and realistic, I think, about what we expect the role we expect work to play in our lives. Like,
Yeah.
I think there's a really interesting parallel here, right, with what's happened with romantic love, right? So
Okay.
it used to be maybe in the 19th century, you'd get married to someone in your community, you'd have babies, you'd kind of raise the children, someone would go to work, you'd be in this kind of wider community, you'd have your friends and family. You wouldn't necessarily expect your wife or husband to solve all your problems. Now we have this idea your primary partner should be fulfilling all your practical, intellectual, spiritual, sexual, emotional, financial needs all at once, all the same time. And I think that's put a lot of pressure on relationships. And I think it's the same thing with work. We used to say, we've got a community, we'll do these other things. It's just a job. I'll leave at 5 p.m. every day. I won't expect everything from my employer. And now what I hear is, I started working at this job and now I don't trust the CEO to do something about climate change. And I feel really depressed and I don't feel like going to work anymore. So we have this much more, I think, emotional relationship with work. We're expecting a lot more of our careers than we used to expect. A lot of that's positive, but I think it's then very easy to kind of blame your problems on the boss, to kind of hold your boss responsible for all these things about your kind of personal life. And the other thing I think that's kind of happened is we've said bring your whole self to work, and we've kind of ended up with HR in our homes. We've ended up with a lot of surveillance. We've ended up with a lot of keystroke tracking. We've ended up with a lot of efforts to control what we're saying on social media. So I suppose I'd say this thing cuts both ways. Like if you expect a lot of your employer is going to increasingly kind of come into your personal life and expect you to toe the line as well.
That just brings to mind there's the psychological contract at the very start of your engagement with work is to be very clear on expectations, isn't it? And then there's also the balance where there's a war on talent then as well. So we're getting people in, and then it's nearly like we're setting people up for failure because businesses are overpromising maybe a little bit.
I mean, a prime thing is a prime example of overpromising is like work's like a family. Well, work's not like a family. You don't usually fire your mother, and so that idea that you have kind of a level of acceptance and tolerance that you would expect from a family member, from someone that is responsible for your pay rise and promotion and whether you keep your job, I think that's dangerous. And I think we've raised expectations we can't fulfill.
I'm going to quote from the book. Being an ethical business is about undertaking a process of discovery about your real world impact and then basing your values and supporting principles on what you find. And I think that's, I suppose, a good aspect of the book that really stuck out for me. It's about your impact on the world. And it's really about having that discovery and reflective quest to say, what is that?
Yeah, and I mean, it sounds so simple, but I kind of think at the end of the day, if a company doesn't treat people with dignity and respect, that at the end of the day is the root cause of all this cynicism and upset about business greed and greenwashing and bad faith and treating ethics as PR. So I quite often, again, when I'm kind of talking to people about this topic, I'll talk about, business doing the right thing and business values. And then people will be like, well, but we're so divided. The world's so divided. No one agrees about politics. No one agrees what the right thing to do is. And that's clearly true. Like I'm in New York right now. We're like in a ragingly divided society. But at the same time, right, we can think of some examples of business conduct that I don't think anyone on any side of the political spectrum thinks is okay. We can think about Amazon making warehouse workers work next to a dead body all day, because someone died, they draw a curtain around the body and they say, carry on working, get to end your shift. There was an example of Hertz, the car rental company, who lost a bunch of cars in car lots somewhere. And rather than admitting it had lost them, it had customers arrested and said they'd stolen these cars. And a woman spent 30 days in jail in Florida. I mean, it's not funny. She had a child. Or we can think about the Ohio train derailment, and it flooded this town in toxic chemicals. And then it emerges that the CEO has been lobbying against safety regulations. All those three examples are companies not treating people with basic dignity and respect. And I would argue nobody thinks that's okay. Yes, a certain amount of things are divisive. And yes, we need to think about those things. But at the end of the day, if you don't treat people properly, if you don't pay a living wage, if you don't treat people fairly, you don't care about your workers, I think that does come back to bite you at the end. I think your negative impacts on human beings are the root cause of all your risks and all your problems, even if how those risks might manifest is really unpredictable.
So another interesting aspect of the book is this concept of the principal agent problem. Can you tell us about that?
So we tend to talk about companies as if they're people, right? So we talk about Apple versus Microsoft, or Coke versus Pepsi, or we talk about whether companies are honest or whether they're authentic or whatever. And this all comes from, it's a metaphor, but it comes from the legal system, which says the corporation's sort of like a fake person. So we've got this corporate principle, which actually, the more you think about it, the weirder it gets. It's very hard to define what is a corporation. But we have this idea that the corporation is like a fake person and it needs real people to execute its will. But because it's a fake person, it then has a problem with real people, managers, paying bribes, committing fraud, doing whatever they want to do, and undermining the interests of the corporate principle. So a lot of how business ethics is framed as kind of like, let's stop the bad people, driving conflicts of interest or doing selfish things on their own behalf in ways that undermine the value of the corporate principle. There's loads of examples of this. This is a real problem. If you have, managers committing fraud, that will destroy the company. I'm not saying this isn't the real problem, but it's not the only problem. When the business model is set up and incentives are set up so that, you don't have any choice but to behave unethically if you're working for that company, then that's not a principal agent problem. That's a different kind of problem. And I think we've had this tendency to sort of say that everything's a problem with bad apples and rogue employees. We have this sort of idea that the problem is that people wake up one day and I wake up one day and I'm like, today's a good day to pay a bribe. that's not, I think, how wrongdoing plays out in most organizations. This is more about the social context, more about the incentives. It's more about the signal that the organization is giving about what it takes to get promoted and to be successful around here, what kind of behavior is valued and rewarded. And so I think we're being simplistic if we say that the problem is bad people, and if we just remove the bad people, we'll protect corporate value. Not saying that doesn't happen. I'm just saying there's a lot more going on here.
So while you were talking there, I found it very fascinating, by the way. Is it the Cook's Tale? I was fascinated by that passage of the book, if you don't mind.
So yeah, I mean, let's start there. Like one thing we kind of can say right away, right, is whenever there's an ethics scandal that hits the headlines, what will usually happen is that the CEO, or maybe it's a police chief, this kind of happened after George Floyd was murdered, this happened after the VW emissions scandal, this happened with Wells Fargo, this has happened with Boeing. The CEO will go to the media in front of the mic and be kind of like, I have no idea how this could have happened. The CEO of VW is like, I had no idea how anyone could have cheated on emissions. Must have just been a few software engineers. Like, the problem couldn't possibly be the incentives and the organization saying, we need to be number one in diesel in the US, just get it done. I don't care how you get it done. It must have been that a bunch of software engineers sort of woke up one day and said, oh, let's fiddle the emissions test. I mean, as I'm describing this, it's clearly ridiculous. That's clearly not what happened. I mean, and I've used the example of George Floyd, the police chief then is like, must be a few bad apples in the organization. So we're not thinking about the systemic factors. We're not thinking about the reality, which is that human beings are very influenced by the social context. And we need to look at that culture, look at that context, look at how the business operates and what it values and rewards, and not just say the problem is a bad person in the software engineering department just woke up and decided one day for their own reasons to start cheating on these tests. I mean, of course, that's not what happened. And so it's convenient to say, if we just find and remove the bad apples, we won't have a problem anymore. One of the reasons it's convenient is it kind of lets leaders off the hook. It means leaders can be like, I had no idea they were going to do something like that. But a leader is responsible. A leader is responsible for wrongdoing, even if you don't personally know about it, because you are modeling what the organization values and rewards. You're modeling whether you are subject to the same rules as everybody else. You're designing the reward systems. So even if you're not personally aware of what went on, you have to understand that as a leader, you're setting the tone and the context for what goes on in that organization. And so a lot of how compliance is designed is all about finding and removing the bad people. And there's a reason that compliance budgets have gone up and up and up over the last few decades, but corporate scandals seem to be just as frequent as ever, because we're kind of doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And then in the Cook's Tale, I mean, this is just fascinating as well, right? So the metaphor of the bad apple was originally about how bad apples cause rot throughout the entire organization. And now we've kind of changed it to the opposite meaning, where we say we just remove the apple and we won't have a wider problem. The original meaning of the metaphor was the precise opposite from how it's now being used, which is very interesting.
So as I was reading the book, then you alluded to it there, that we get our cues from that ethical leader. It's the role of ethical leadership there. Surely there's a case where the CEO is getting pressure as well from the board. And then the board, then who are they listening to? It's kind of a vicious circle that people are stuck in. And then if consumers don't change, or there's something there, isn't there, that's missing?
Yeah, I mean, I think accountability from the board is often a real problem. The board is still very often a bunch of people the CEO handpicked, a bunch of people who are the CEO's friends, who all play golf together, who all know each other, who are all on a bunch of other boards. And so, if we're really expecting accountability from inside the company, I think we run into those kind of challenges with independence and independent decision making in terms of those kind of authorities. And then I think, the CEO's personal conduct is certainly important. But if you're in a big company and you're just working there, you might not run into the CEO very often. So it's important for the CEO to be an ethical person, but it's also important you put the structures and systems in place and you think about ethics as an organizational design issue, not just a question of kind of issuing rules and telling people what not to do.
And speaking of that, then in the book, if memory serves me correctly, you talk about ethical infrastructure, and then it's all these notions of what gets measured, gets managed, and from memory serves me right, you say sunlight is the best disinfectant. So ethical infrastructure, like, where can we improve?
Well, I mean, I think, one thing is the kind of incentives that we put in place. If we're saying, you've got to hit your bonus by any means necessary, and that's how you get paid out, we don't look at badly behaving assholes. Basically, we don't look at our high performing, badly behaving assholes, So if someone meets their targets, we tend to just kind of not question them. So there's something about how a company makes money, how a company conducts itself. There's something about what kind of behavior gets rewarded, who gets promoted, what kind of people end up in the C-suite. Is it kind of people that kiss up and kick down? Is it people that take credit for other people's work? So we need to kind of think about the kind of behavior that we want in an organization. And then we need to try and design incentive systems that reward and punish that. This is really, really difficult for sure. Something else that might happen is kind of what Cass Sunstein called sludge. So are you the sort of company that ends up with 1 million rules and says everyone's got to kind of memorize all the rules, even if you don't really understand what the point of all the rules is, and you just kind of have this kind of draconian system of all these documents and everything's really confusing and you can't find help and you can't raise concerns? So there are all sorts of ways I think this can go wrong. I think as well in cultures, organizational cultures, and VW would be a good example, where growth at all costs is the goal. We've just got to win no matter what. Those kind of cultures are very, very vulnerable to unethical behavior. But how you measure and manage a lot of these efforts is, by definition, very difficult. Let's think about something like using the whistleblowing line. Well, if a lot of people call the whistleblowing line, does that mean you've got an unethical organization, or does that mean you've got an organization where people feel comfortable raising concerns? What's good in this context? It's really hard to say, right? If no one's calling the whistleblowing line, does that mean you're a perfectly ethical company? Or does it just mean that everyone's terrified and they don't trust that it's confidential? So I could say that about almost any metric. Like, it's very hard to say, if you just measure this, it'll be okay. And you just use the phrase, you manage what you measure. Another really good example of how the origin of that phrase was actually about the dangers of stupid measurement for its own sake and trying to quantify everything. But again, we've kind of adapted this to have the opposite meaning from what the author originally meant.
So let me go back to that question about ESG. Like, this is the very confusing thing in my mind, that there's a real focus, and rightly so, on ESG, saying that it's like you're trying to implement ESG, you're adding a whole load of KPIs there. This is now getting either, it depends on the company, it's the focus of one person, a sole person in a company, or it's now added to my ever-growing KPIs on my performance management review, and now I'm frustrated as an employee. Loads of challenges went to ESG. Have you kind of any insights for our listeners on that?
So I think, the idea of it is not stupid. The idea of it says, if we can measure performance on a lot of environmental, social, and governance issues, which we've traditionally thought of as being non-financial or kind of non-market, if we can understand how well a company's doing on some of these metrics, that will help us understand how that company's creating value. That will help us understand whether this is a good or bad business that will survive over the long term. So that's the idea, that if you measure this set of new metrics, that then those metrics, or understanding those metrics, will help you understand the performance of the business. And it's a way, I think, partly a way to kind of measure this shift from intangible value. It's partly to intangible value, right? It's partly a recognition that traditional accounting measures may not tell us everything that we need to know about a company in this more intangible world where we've got all these negative externalities, and where traditional accounting says if a company can get away with pumping pollution into the river and getting the government to clean it up, that'll be great, So ESG we can think of as an emerging and highly imperfect effort to measure some of this stuff. So what's the problem? The problem is there are dozens, if not hundreds, of ESG issues that you can potentially measure. The second problem is not everything can be quantified. The third problem is an enormous number of these metrics can be gamed or treated as PR. Let's take something super simple. I mean, environmental disclosures in theory are easier than something like, is your company treating workers fairly, right? So let's think about something like how much water it takes to make a bottle of Coca-Cola. You would think that you would be able to put a number on that and then maybe look at the how much water Pepsi takes, and then see is Coca-Cola or Pepsi making a better use of water, a more efficient use of water. Well, it's not that easy, is it? I mean, for one thing, Pepsi and Coke actually have really different business models. So you can't say Coke uses this much water and Pepsi uses this much water and say what's good or bad very easily. Even more importantly, what water? Are we talking about the water that goes in a bottle of Coke? Are we talking about the water in the manufacturing process? Are we talking about the water used in the transport? Are we talking about the water used to grow the sugar? So if we say to a company, we're going to track all these metrics and we're going to use it to deploy capital, and we're going to use it so investors can decide whether to invest in this company, I don't think we should be surprised that what we end up with is companies spinning these numbers to look as good as possible, and maybe hiding stuff that makes them look bad and changing their goals all the time. And then, so, we're trying to do something very complicated and we're making it sound simpler than it is. And I think the final thing that's happened is now there's an enormous industry of ESG people gathering data, measuring stuff, providing analysis. It's a big industry, ESG Inc. And so obviously now there's a bunch of people that have got a very big agenda kind of carrying this on. So the core idea is really good. The execution, I think, is really, really challenging. And then we're sort of telling a story that, if companies just disclose more and more, then somehow we'll be able to hold them accountable. But no one really ever explains how that's supposed to happen.
And funny you mentioned that, because I was going to ask you about transparency then. So you're trying to be transparent. Then you're obviously trying to protect your competitive edge. Then we are GDPR. Transparency, is it always a good thing? Because sometimes when you highlight something, I think you mentioned this in the book then as well, is we highlight something and we go, oh, there's a problem here, but then we don't do anything about it. There's inaction there. That even creates more ire or more frustration, isn't there, when it comes to transparency?
Yeah, I mean, I think we tend to talk about transparency in this really simplistic way. Just be more transparent, tell the public what you think, be more authentic, and there won't be a problem. So but that's not true for all sorts of reasons. One, we don't pay enough attention at all to the receiver. Like, I teach ESG and sustainability at NYU. And I find myself standing in the supermarket being like, look at all these labels. What am I supposed to buy? Organic coffee, fair trade coffee, coffee from this country, coffee from that country. I don't know. I can't figure it out. And I'm supposed to know something about this topic. So I think we're overestimating how able you or I or the average person is to kind of say, look at these labels, look at these disclosures, look at what the company is saying and say this is good and this is bad. Arguably, that's a stupid question anyway. We shouldn't be sorting companies into good and bad. Then we've kind of created this big industry of kind of disclosure and said disclosure will somehow lead to accountability, but we're not sure how. And then, we've now got this expectation companies need to disclose and report on everything all the time in real time. That takes resources. That takes resources away from efforts you could be using to actually do something about the problem, rather than just data gather and describe and report the problem. So it's really kind of fascinating, a little depressing. There's an organization called the Carbon Disclosure Project. It was founded in 2000. And if you can see the founding statements on its website, and it's kind of like, we've got all these investors, we've got trillions of dollars of investment money, we're going to get companies to disclose their carbon emissions, and then we're going to figure out how to solve climate change. And now it's 2025. We're still arguing about what companies should disclose, and we haven't got any closer. Well, we've got maybe a bit closer to addressing climate change, but don't think it's been about those disclosures particularly.
In chapter 6, then, you talk about putting human rights at the center of your efforts, because we keep talking about multiple ways to address ESG and how to measure and stuff like that. And there's something about human rights where you just can't get it wrong, isn't there? Like it's not a nice to have, it's a need to have, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think human rights is treated as a nice to have these days in most, not all countries. And, and addressing human rights challenges is fiendishly difficult. So let's be kind of clear up front. But what I like about human rights frameworks, which are different from ethics and compliance frameworks and different from ESG frameworks, is that human rights frameworks say, this is the responsibility of the government. It is the responsibility of the government to protect human rights and put the right laws in place. It's the responsibility of business to respect human rights. So it thinks about that relationship between the business and the government. It thinks about what are the respective roles and responsibilities. And then the other thing I like about it is it's focused on your impact on human beings. That, I think, is the root cause of what it takes to be regarded as ethical or unethical. The third thing I like about human rights frameworks is they allow you to have your own values and self-determination. So going back to that whole conversation we were having about corporate overreach into our private lives, human rights would say you should respect people's values. You should respect their rights to be, I want to be a Satanist at the weekend. Human rights would say I can go ahead and do that. My employer doesn't have the right to come into my private life and tell me what to do or to impose values I might not share onto me. So I'm certainly not saying human rights frameworks are perfect. There's a ton of problems with them. We could talk about that. But I think it's a little clearer if you're trying to anchor your ethical commitments. I think it's better to think about your impact on real human beings in your workforce, in your value chain, in your customer base, than it is to try and focus on these metrics, these ESG metrics, which are very confusing, or to try and focus on the law, which has become very confusing and unpredictable as well.
Okay. Now, there's something that we talked about before. We talked about that Dieselgate. And if I'm in a company and I'm concerned, and I think this is on page 164 or 165, if memory serves me correct, you talk about how do I recognize if I'm in an unethical culture? Okay, so because you've certain questions on that. So what do unethical cultures have in common then?
Yeah, I wrote an article about this a long time ago. I did some work on this a long time ago, and it kind of makes its way into the book. But there's a Harvard Business Review article I wrote called 5 Signs Your Organization Might Be Headed for an Ethics Scandal that people can read if they want to find out about this. So yeah, I did some work and I asked, like, if a company's heading into an ethics scandal, does it show up in the culture first? Can you look at cultures of companies and say, this is a company that's got a problem? And I found that I found there were common patterns, and I've mentioned a few of them already, but let's just go through them. One is this idea of growth and winning at all costs. If you talk to people, there was a big bribery scandal with the German company Siemens in 2006. And afterwards, executives were like, we thought we had to do it. We thought the company would go out of business unless we paid these bribes. So that sense of kind of necessity and urgency, you're going to die unless you win, is the first thing you would see in a culture. The second thing you would see is leaders who create plausible deniability. They say, do as I say, not as I do. I never meant you to do that. They're really authoritarian. They say one set of rules for you, one set of rules for me. There's also kind of draconian decision-making and authority structures where you may not feel comfortable raising concerns. There's incentives that are designed without regard for market conditions, that prioritize you to behave really badly, to, seek to cut corners at all costs just so you hit your targets. And then very often there's kind of in-group culture and language. People kind of joke. People feel ashamed if they're doing something unethical, and they kind of joke to cover it up. So you tend to see a lot of kind of in-group language and in-groups and out-groups, and kind of maybe jokes about war and sport, and this kind of, idea again that we can't do anything wrong. Like if you look at the Boeing emails, you had all these kind of engineers kind of being like, this is a regulation designed by monkeys, and I've just kind of, ha ha ha, I deserve to go to hell for what I just did, and that kind of thing. And that's a sign people feel really uncomfortable, and so they're turning this issue into a joke. So yeah, there's lots more reading about this. People use euphemisms. People act in certain ways. And another thing that you tend to see in unethical cultures is the development of a social cocoon. So you've got a particular leader who's got this isolated team, and everyone's really loyal to each other, and you kind of can't figure out why that team's so successful or what they're doing. And that's a leader that's created a very certain sort of socialization. And then new people come along and they get kind of inculcated into this culture and encouraged to behave in the same way.
So we're creating lots of questions for people. We're very provocative in the way that we're presenting this. And if we were to frame it in a more hopeful way, then, okay. Again, you mentioned my lecture actually in Wharton, Professor Mary Hunter McDonald, where employees can be powerful agents because they expect purpose and organization to be grounded in values they identify with. So there's room for hope there, isn't there? That there's a lot of things that we can do. So just we start with employees being powerful agents. What's the role of employees then?
Yeah, I do a lot of work on kind of employee activism and employees speaking up. And I think one thing we can see right away is that transparency and transparency tools and social media have really kind of changed the environment for companies. Think about after Elon Musk acquired Twitter, we had like employees of Twitter, like blow by blow accounts of everything that's kind of going on. We can think about, there's been a whole thing on TikTok of employees being laid off, and they film the conversation with HR and they put it out there on TikTok. So I think employees have got this new power to kind of call out and undercut the corporate message in ways that are distinct from labor market dynamics. And I think so we've got these kind of newly empowered workers, like the students in my classroom, they're really got a nose for companies that lie and are inauthentic. And they're much more prepared to use kind of reputational tools to try and drive change. And then they do care about a broader range of issues and expect companies to take those on. And so I think those pressures are really interesting. I think they're really important. I think social media kind of changes the narrative. It means it's much harder to control the narrative. It really puts companies kind of in society in a really, really new way. And companies have never really been distinct from society. If racism is a problem in society, racism is going to be a problem in the workforce. But we've had these metaphors and myths that it is. And now I think what we've got is leaders that need to understand they're part of society. And as society changes, business needs to change. And so we can look in the short term, and there's a lot of very depressing things going on. But I think if we look over the last 20 years, there have been these really big tectonic plate shifts in terms of what we're expecting from employers, what we're expecting from companies. And so, I've made a lot of kind of depressing comments about climate change in this conversation, but business leaders generally expect that climate change is real, and they know they need to manage for the energy transition, and they know that burning coal forever is not really going to fly. That is a real change that's happened. So I think it's very easy to get kind of lost in the day-to-day and feel that it's all depressing and it's hopeless. If you take a step back, then I do think we've got these big shifts going on. And then I do think even more importantly, we've got this new generation of leaders coming online who thinks about leadership and influence and responsibility and ethics in very new and interesting ways. So I tend to think that, with a new generation of leaders and maybe, some of these crusty old people that that can't get to the point, maybe leaving and retiring, we might end up with somewhere different and better.
So we definitely have ended up somewhere different and better. And this book is such a good read. So finally, with that, if people to find more about you, Alison, and what you do and your book, how might they do so?
Yeah, so I have a website, AlisonTaylor.co. There's one L in the Alison, so ALISONTAYLOR.co. I'm also on LinkedIn. Like, I'm really easy to find on LinkedIn, Alison Taylor NYU. I post nearly every day. We have awesome conversations on my LinkedIn feed. So I'd invite anyone listening to find me on LinkedIn and join the conversation and share your views. And please tell me where I'm wrong.
Alison, thank you so much for joining the Workplace Podcast. Pleasure to have you today.
Absolute joy to talk to you, and thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to the Workplace Podcast. I really appreciate you being part of the conversation. If you found value in today's episode and want to support what we're building here, you'll find a link to our Patreon in the description. As a workplace expert, I'm here to help you resolve your workplace dilemmas. If your organization could benefit from my expertise, feel free to get in touch via our website, yellowwood.ie. Yellowwood, your external learning and development partner. Take a different path to success in your career, leadership, team, and organization. Until next time, take care, and we'll see you soon.